Captain James Sullivan had always been the kind of man who disappeared into crowds. At 32 years old, he stood average height with brown hair that never seemed to stay in place, despite military regulations. His fellow pilots at the airbase often joked that Jim could walk through the mess hall, and nobody would remember seeing him 5 minutes later. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his head down during briefings, and never joined the evening card games that echoed through the barracks. The other pilots had their theories about Sullivan. Some thought he was just shy. Others believed he was arrogant and thought himself above their company. Lieutenant Parker, who bunked next to him, swore that Sullivan read technical manuals for fun, spending hours studying aircraft specifications and combat tactics while everyone else wrote letters home or played music. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of them realized. Sullivan had grown up on a small farm in Nebraska, where his father taught him that actions spoke louder than words. His childhood was filled with early morning chores, quiet dinners, and the vast silence of open fields. When he enlisted in the Air Force, he brought that same quiet determination with him. While other cadets boasted about their flying skills or competed for attention, Sullivan simply flew. He absorbed every lesson, practiced every maneuver, and studied every weakness in enemy aircraft until the knowledge became part of him. His instructors noticed something different about Sullivan during training. He had an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure, making split-second decisions that seemed almost instinctive. His shooting accuracy was exceptional, but more importantly, he could think 3 moves ahead of his opponents in simulated dogfights. However, Sullivan never bragged about his achievements. He accepted praise with a simple nod and continued preparing for the next challenge. The war in the Pacific had been raging for 2 years when Sullivan arrived at the forward air base. The facility buzzed with constant activity as mechanics serviced aircraft, pilots prepared for missions, and radio operators coordinated with fleet operations. Sullivan was assigned to Squadron 15, a unit that had already lost 6 pilots in the previous month. The survivors were a tight-knit group who had learned to rely on each other for survival. Major Reynolds, the squadron commander, studied Sullivan's file with interest. His training scores were impressive, but his personality evaluations noted his tendency to work alone. Reynolds had seen quiet pilots before, and they usually fell into 2 categories: those who cracked under pressure and those who became legends. He was curious to see which category Sullivan would fill. Sullivan's first few missions were routine patrol flights and escort duties. He followed orders precisely, maintained perfect formation, and communicated only essential information over the radio. His wingmen found him reliable but distant. He never shared stories about home, never complained about the food or weather, and never seemed to get rattled by close calls with enemy aircraft. Some pilots interpreted this as confidence, others as coldness. What none of them knew was that Sullivan was constantly learning. Every flight taught him something new about enemy tactics, aircraft capabilities, and the rhythm of aerial combat. He noticed patterns in how enemy formations attacked, weaknesses in their defensive strategies, and the subtle signs that preceded major engagements. While his squadron mates relaxed between missions, Sullivan studied intelligence reports and aircraft recognition manuals. The base photographer once captured Sullivan sitting alone on his aircraft wing, staring at the horizon as the sun set behind him. The image perfectly captured the isolation that seemed to surround him. His fellow pilots saw loneliness in that photograph, but Sullivan saw preparation. Every quiet moment was an opportunity to think, to plan, and to ready himself for the challenges ahead. 3 months into his deployment, Sullivan had flown 37 missions without firing a shot in anger. His squadron had encountered enemy aircraft several times, but the engagements had been brief and inconclusive. The other pilots began to wonder if their quiet colleague had what it took when the real fighting started. They were about to find out that their assumptions about James Sullivan were completely wrong. The morning of September 15th began like any other at the forward airbase. Sullivan woke before dawn, as was his habit, and made his way to the mess hall while most of the base still slept. He ate his breakfast in silence, reviewing the weather reports and mission briefings that had been posted the night before. The meteorologist predicted clear skies with good visibility, perfect flying conditions that could bring either routine patrols or intense combat. Lieutenant Parker stumbled into the mess hall an hour later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He found Sullivan exactly where he expected, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. Parker had tried numerous times to break through Sullivan's reserve, but his attempts at conversation were always met with polite, brief responses. Today felt different somehow, though Parker couldn't explain why. The briefing room filled with pilots as Major Reynolds prepared to outline the day's missions. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the northern sector, with reconnaissance flights spotting large formations moving toward Allied shipping lanes. Reynolds assigned patrol sectors to each flight, emphasizing the need for vigilance and quick communication if enemy contact was made. Sullivan received his assignment without comment, a solo reconnaissance mission over a disputed island chain. His task was to observe and report, not to engage unless absolutely necessary. The mission was considered routine, the kind of assignment often given to steady, reliable pilots who could be trusted to follow orders and return with accurate information. Reynolds chose Sullivan because he knew the quiet pilot would do exactly what was asked of him, nothing more and nothing less. After the briefing, pilots scattered to prepare their aircraft and equipment. Sullivan walked to his P-51 Mustang with his usual measured pace, conducting his pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. He checked every control surface, tested every switch, and examined every rivet with the same attention to detail he brought to everything else. His crew chief, Sergeant Morrison, had learned to appreciate Sullivan's thoroughness. Morrison had serviced aircraft for 8 years and worked with dozens of pilots. Most were either overconfident hotshots who barely glanced at their planes or nervous rookies who found problems that didn't exist. Sullivan was different. He knew his aircraft intimately, understanding exactly how each system should sound, feel, and respond. When Sullivan said something needed attention, Morrison knew it was worth investigating. The sergeant watched Sullivan complete his inspection and climb into the cockpit. There was something almost ceremonial about the way the pilot prepared for flight. He adjusted his seat, checked his instruments, and tested his controls with the same sequence every time. Morrison had noticed that Sullivan never seemed hurried or anxious before a mission. He approached flying the way a master craftsman approached his work, with respect, preparation, and quiet confidence. Sullivan started his engine and taxied to the runway, acknowledging the tower's clearance with a brief radio call. His takeoff was smooth and precise, the result of hundreds of hours of practice and natural ability. As his aircraft climbed into the morning sky, Sullivan felt the familiar sense of peace that came with leaving the ground behind. In the air, surrounded by infinite blue, he could think clearly and focus completely on the task ahead. The flight to his patrol sector took 40 minutes, during which Sullivan maintained radio silence and observed the ocean below. He noted the position of several Allied ships, the movement of clouds that might affect visibility later in the day, and the absence of any unusual activity on the water's surface. His trained eyes swept the horizon constantly, looking for the telltale glints of sunlight on metal that might indicate aircraft. As he approached the disputed islands, Sullivan began his systematic reconnaissance pattern. He photographed strategic positions, noted changes since the last intelligence reports, and maintained careful logs of everything he observed. The work required intense concentration, as missing a crucial detail could have serious consequences for future operations. Sullivan's reputation for thorough, accurate reporting had made him a favorite choice for these sensitive missions. 2 hours into his patrol, Sullivan noticed something that made him pause. Far to the north, barely visible even with his keen eyesight, he spotted a formation of aircraft heading south. They were too distant to identify immediately, but their course would bring them directly toward the Allied shipping lanes he had observed earlier. Sullivan reached for his radio to report the sighting, then hesitated. Protocol required confirmation before alerting the fleet, and he was still too far away to be certain of what he was seeing. Sullivan made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to base immediately with his incomplete report, he altered course to intercept the unknown formation. His orders had been clear about avoiding unnecessary engagement, but he also knew that accurate intelligence could save lives. As he turned north and pushed his throttle forward, Sullivan had no idea that he was flying toward the most important 20 minutes of his life. Sullivan climbed to 15,000 feet as he approached the unknown formation, using the sun's position to mask his approach. Years of studying enemy tactics had taught him that altitude and positioning were often more important than speed or firepower in aerial combat. He maintained radio silence, knowing that any transmission could alert enemy pilots to his presence and compromise his ability to gather intelligence. As the distance closed, Sullivan's heart rate remained steady despite the growing tension. Through his canopy, he could now make out the distinctive silhouettes of 6 Japanese Zero fighters flying in a tight formation. They were heading directly toward the shipping lanes where a convoy of Allied transport vessels was scheduled to pass within the hour. The enemy pilots appeared confident and unaware of any threat, maintaining a course that would put them in perfect position to attack the defenseless cargo ships. Sullivan faced a critical decision. His orders were to observe and report, not to engage superior numbers. 6 against 1 were impossible odds by any reasonable calculation, and his training emphasized the importance of living to fight another day. However, the convoy below had no fighter protection and would be completely vulnerable to the approaching enemy aircraft. By the time Sullivan could return to base and alert the squadron, the attack would be over, and the ships would be destroyed or sinking. The quiet pilot who had spent months avoiding attention suddenly found himself in a position where action was unavoidable. Sullivan checked his ammunition count, fuel levels, and engine temperatures one final time. His P-51 was in perfect condition, and he had full ammunition for both his machine guns and cannon. More importantly, he had something the enemy pilots lacked: the element of surprise and 3 months of careful observation about their tactics and weaknesses. Sullivan had noticed during previous encounters that Japanese pilots often flew in rigid formations that prioritized group coordination over individual initiative. They relied heavily on their squadron leaders' decisions and rarely broke formation unless specifically ordered to do so. This discipline was their strength in many situations, but Sullivan realized it could also be their weakness if approached correctly. He positioned himself above and behind the enemy formation, using cloud cover to remain hidden until the last possible moment. Sullivan's plan was simple but required perfect timing and execution. He would attack the formation leader first, hoping to create confusion and panic among the remaining pilots. If he could disrupt their coordination quickly enough, he might be able to engage them individually rather than facing all 6 at once. Sullivan dove toward the enemy formation, his aircraft screaming through the air as he built up speed. His first burst of machine gun fire caught the lead Zero completely by surprise, the rounds tearing through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin and striking the engine. Black smoke immediately began pouring from the damaged fighter as it fell away from the formation, its pilot fighting desperately to maintain control. The remaining 5 Japanese pilots reacted exactly as Sullivan had predicted. Instead of immediately turning to engage him, they maintained formation while their leader tried to issue orders over the radio. This hesitation gave Sullivan precious seconds to position himself for his next attack. He pulled up sharply, using his aircraft's superior climbing ability to gain altitude while the enemy pilot struggled to reorganize. Sullivan's second attack came from a different angle, targeting the wingman on the right side of the formation. His cannon shells found their mark, exploding against the Zero's fuel tank and creating a brilliant fireball that lit up the morning sky. The pilot had no chance to escape as his aircraft disintegrated around him. Now 4 enemy fighters remained, and their formation discipline was beginning to crack under the sudden vicious assault. The surviving Japanese pilots finally abandoned their rigid formation and turned to engage Sullivan individually. This was exactly what he had hoped for, as it eliminated their numerical advantage and allowed him to use his superior aircraft performance and tactical knowledge to even the odds. Sullivan rolled inverted and dove toward the ocean, drawing the enemy fighters into a pursuit that would test their skills against his careful preparation. As the 4 Zeros followed him down, Sullivan smiled grimly. For months, his fellow pilots had wondered whether the quiet man from Nebraska had what it took to fight when the stakes were highest. They were about to get their answer, though none of them would witness what happened next. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific sky, Sullivan was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones nobody suspects. The real fight was just beginning, and Sullivan felt more focused and determined than he had ever been in his life. Every hour of study, every moment of preparation, and every quiet evening spent analyzing enemy tactics had led to this moment. The convoy below continued its course, unaware that their survival now depended on a pilot most people forgot the moment they met him. Sullivan's dive toward the ocean surface was calculated and deliberate, designed to force the pursuing Zero fighters into making the tactical errors he had studied so carefully. As the 4 enemy aircraft followed him down, Sullivan monitored their positions through quick glances in his mirrors while maintaining perfect control of his own machine. The Japanese pilots were aggressive but predictable, exactly as he had observed in previous encounters. At 2,000 feet above the waves, Sullivan suddenly pulled back on his stick and climbed sharply to the right. The maneuver stressed his aircraft to its limits, but the P-51's superior engineering allowed it to handle forces that would have torn apart a lighter fighter. 2 of the pursuing Zeros tried to follow his climb, and immediately found themselves in trouble as their engines struggled with the sudden change in attitude and airspeed. Sullivan had anticipated this reaction. Japanese pilots were trained to maintain aggressive pursuit, but their aircraft lacked the power and structural strength to match the American fighters' performance in vertical maneuvers. As the 2 Zeros fell behind, Sullivan reversed his turn and dove back toward them, his machine guns already trained on the closer target. His 3rd kill came as the enemy pilot desperately tried to evade Sullivan's attack. The Zero twisted and turned through the sky, its pilot displaying considerable skill and courage. But Sullivan had studied these evasion patterns for months. He anticipated each move, positioning his aircraft to cut off escape routes and maintain firing position. When his bullets finally found their target, the Zero's wing folded under the impact, and the aircraft spun helplessly toward the ocean below. 3 enemy fighters remained, and their pilots were now fully aware that they faced an opponent unlike any they had encountered before. The rigid formation tactics they had relied on were useless against Sullivan's unconventional approach. Instead of engaging them as a group, he was systematically isolating and destroying individual aircraft while avoiding their attempts to coordinate attacks against him. The remaining Japanese pilots tried to establish a defensive circle, a tactic designed to provide mutual protection while wearing down their attackers' ammunition and fuel. Sullivan recognized the maneuver immediately and smiled coldly. He had seen this same defensive pattern in training films and intelligence reports, and he knew exactly how to break it. Instead of attacking the circle directly, Sullivan climbed to high altitude and waited. His patience was another weapon the enemy pilots hadn't expected. While they maintained their defensive formation and burned precious fuel, Sullivan conserved his resources and studied their movements. He noticed that one pilot was flying slightly out of position, creating a small gap in their mutual coverage. Sullivan's 4th attack came from directly above, diving through the gap he had identified with devastating precision. His target never saw him coming until cannon shells began exploding around his cockpit. The Zero pilot tried to roll away from the attack, but Sullivan had anticipated this move and adjusted his aim accordingly. The enemy aircraft caught fire immediately and began its final dive toward the ocean. Now only 2 Japanese fighters remained, and their pilots were beginning to show signs of panic. Their careful formation had been destroyed, half their squadron was gone, and their opponents seemed to anticipate their every move. The psychological impact of Sullivan's systematic assault was as devastating as his accurate gunnery. The 2 surviving pilots made their final mistake by trying to attack Sullivan simultaneously from different directions. This tactic might have worked against a less experienced pilot, but Sullivan had practiced defending against multiple attackers during countless training sessions. He waited until both Zeros committed to their attack runs, then executed a maneuver that brought both aircraft into his firing line at the same time. Sullivan's 5th kill came as he fired a long burst into the first Zero's engine compartment. The aircraft immediately began trailing smoke and oil, its pilot struggling to maintain control as his engine seized up. Rather than finish off the damaged fighter, Sullivan immediately turned his attention to the final enemy aircraft, knowing that a wounded opponent was less dangerous than a healthy one. The last Japanese pilot showed remarkable courage, continuing his attack even though he was now completely alone against an opponent who had just destroyed 5 of his squadron mates. Sullivan respected this bravery even as he prepared to end the fight. The final engagement was brief and decisive, with Sullivan's superior position and marksmanship determining the outcome within seconds. As the sixth and final zero fell burning toward the ocean, Sullivan found himself alone in the vast Pacific sky. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes, but in that time, he had achieved something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew the quiet, unassuming pilot. 6 enemy aircraft had been destroyed by a man who rarely spoke above a whisper and seemed to disappear in crowds. Sullivan checked his fuel gauge and ammunition counter, then turned his aircraft toward home. The convoy below continued its journey, unaware that they had just been saved by the most unlikely hero imaginable. As he flew back toward base, Sullivan began composing his mission report in his mind, wondering how he would explain what had just happened to Major Reynolds and his squadron mates. Sullivan's flight back to base gave him time to process what had just occurred. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the methodical analysis that had always characterized his approach to flying. He reviewed each engagement in his mind, noting what had worked well and what might have been done differently. Even after achieving the impossible, Sullivan remained focused on learning and improvement. The radio crackled to life as he approached the airfield. Base tower to Sullivan, report your status and mission results. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Hayes, who handled communications during the day shift. Sullivan keyed his microphone and replied in his usual calm tone. Sullivan returning from patrol. Mission accomplished. Request priority landing for debriefing. There was a pause before Hayes responded. Copy that, Sullivan. You're cleared for immediate approach. Major Reynolds requests you report to his office as soon as you land. Sullivan acknowledged the instruction and began his descent, wondering how much detail he should include in his initial report. The facts were extraordinary enough that they might be difficult to believe without corroborating evidence. As Sullivan's P-51 touched down on the runway, Sergeant Morrison noticed something unusual about the aircraft's appearance. The wing surfaces showed stress marks from high-speed maneuvers, and there were powder burns around the gun ports indicating that all weapons had been fired. Morrison had seen enough combat aircraft to recognize the signs of a serious engagement, but Sullivan's calm demeanor suggested nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Sullivan completed his post-flight inspection with the same attention to detail he always showed, despite Morrison's obvious curiosity about the mission. When the sergeant finally asked if everything had gone according to plan, Sullivan simply nodded and said, "Aircraft performed perfectly. No mechanical issues to report." He gathered his flight gear and headed toward the squadron headquarters, leaving Morrison to wonder what had happened during the supposedly routine patrol. Major Reynolds was waiting in his office with Captain Torres, the squadron's intelligence officer. Both men looked up expectantly as Sullivan entered and saluted. Reynolds gestured toward a chair and said, "Have a seat, Sullivan. We received an interesting radio transmission about 30 minutes ago. The convoy you were supposed to observe reported seeing explosions and aircraft wreckage in their area. Know anything about that?" Sullivan sat down and opened his logbook, his expression unchanged. "Yes, sir. I encountered 6 enemy fighters preparing to attack the convoy. I engaged and destroyed all 6 aircraft to prevent them from completing their mission." The matter-of-fact tone of his report made the extraordinary claim sound almost routine. Captain Torres leaned forward in his chair, studying Sullivan's face for any sign of exaggeration or uncertainty. "You're telling us that you single-handedly destroyed 6 enemy fighters? That's a claim that requires substantial verification, Lieutenant." Sullivan nodded and handed over his logbook, which contained detailed notes about each engagement, including times, altitudes, and tactical observations. Reynolds examined the logbook while Torres questioned Sullivan about specific details of the encounter. The pilot's answers were precise and consistent, delivered in the same quiet voice he used for routine mission reports. There was no boasting, no dramatic embellishment, just a straightforward account of what had happened. His calm demeanor was almost more convincing than any passionate declaration would have been. The telephone rang, interrupting the debriefing. Reynolds answered and spoke briefly with someone at Fleet Headquarters. When he hung up, his expression had changed completely. That was Admiral Morrison's staff. They've confirmed wreckage from 6 Japanese aircraft in the area you described. The convoy commander also reports observing a single American fighter engaging multiple enemy aircraft. Sullivan showed no reaction to this confirmation of his report. He sat quietly while Reynolds and Torres exchanged glances, both men struggling to process the implications of what they had just learned. The quiet pilot who barely spoke during squadron meetings had just achieved one of the most remarkable aerial victories in the war. Torres cleared his throat and continued his questioning. "Walk us through your tactical approach, Sullivan. How did you manage to engage 6 aircraft without being shot down yourself?" Sullivan's explanation was methodical and detailed, revealing the depth of his preparation and the careful analysis that had made his success possible. As Sullivan described his tactics, Reynolds began to understand that the victory was not the result of luck or reckless courage. Every move had been calculated, every decision based on careful observation and study. The pilot who seemed to disappear in crowds had been quietly preparing for this moment for months, studying enemy tactics and aircraft performance with scholarly dedication. The debriefing continued for 2 hours as Torres documented every aspect of the engagement for his intelligence report. Sullivan answered each question with patient precision, providing details that would prove valuable for training other pilots. His willingness to share tactical knowledge reflected the same selfless dedication that had driven him to risk his life protecting the convoy. When the formal debriefing finally ended, Reynolds stood and extended his hand to Sullivan. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. This kind of performance deserves recognition at the highest levels." Sullivan shook his commander's hand but showed no excitement about potential awards or publicity. His only comment was a request to return to flight status as soon as possible. As Sullivan left the headquarters building, word of his achievement was already spreading through the base. By evening, every pilot, mechanic, and support crew member would know about the quiet man who had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in 20 minutes. The pilot who had spent months being ignored and overlooked was about to discover that anonymity was no longer possible. News of Sullivan's extraordinary victory spread through the airbase like wildfire. By evening, pilots who had barely acknowledged his existence were gathering around his bunk, eager to hear details about the engagement. Lieutenant Parker, who had tried unsuccessfully for months to draw Sullivan into conversation, now found himself bombarded with questions about his quiet bunkmate's personality and habits. Sullivan handled the sudden attention with the same calm demeanor he brought to everything else. He answered questions politely but without elaboration, sharing tactical insights while deflecting personal inquiries. When younger pilots asked for advice about aerial combat, he focused on preparation and study rather than dramatic stories about the fight itself. His modest response to fame only increased the respect his fellow aviators felt for him. Sergeant Morrison found himself fielding questions from mechanics throughout the Pacific Fleet who wanted to know about Sullivan's aircraft and maintenance requirements. The crew chief took pride in explaining how the pilot's meticulous pre-flight inspections and careful handling had kept his P-51 in perfect condition. Morrison had always respected Sullivan's professionalism, but now he understood that he had been working with someone truly exceptional. Within 48 hours, reporters from military newspapers arrived at the base to interview Sullivan about his achievement. The pilot who had spent his entire military career avoiding attention now found himself posed for photographs and asked to provide quotes for articles that would be read throughout the Allied forces. Sullivan cooperated with the interviews but insisted on focusing attention on his squadron and the importance of teamwork in aerial combat. Major Reynolds received orders to forward a detailed report about Sullivan's performance to higher headquarters, along with recommendations for appropriate recognition. The squadron commander had written dozens of similar reports during his career, but none had been as remarkable as this one. Sullivan's achievement would likely result in significant medals and possibly promotion, though the pilot himself seemed uninterested in personal advancement. The strategic implications of Sullivan's victory became clear when intelligence analysts reviewed the engagement. The 6 destroyed Japanese fighters had been part of a larger operation designed to disrupt Allied shipping in the region. By eliminating this threat, Sullivan had not only saved the immediate convoy but had also protected future naval operations. His quick thinking and decisive action had strategic consequences far beyond what anyone initially realized. Other pilots began studying Sullivan's tactical approach, trying to understand how he had achieved such an impossible victory. His emphasis on preparation and enemy analysis started influencing training programs throughout the Pacific Theater. Flight instructors incorporated his techniques into their curricula, and squadron commanders encouraged their pilots to adopt Sullivan's methodical approach to combat preparation. Sullivan's personal life remained largely unchanged despite his newfound fame. He continued reading technical manuals in the evenings, maintained his rigorous exercise routine, and showed the same quiet courtesy toward everyone on the base. The only difference was that his fellow pilots now listened carefully when he offered tactical suggestions during mission briefings. His voice carried weight that it had never possessed before. The psychological impact of Sullivan's achievement extended beyond his own squadron. Pilots throughout the Pacific Fleet drew inspiration from the story of the quiet aviator who had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft through skill and preparation rather than luck or superior numbers. His success proved that careful study and methodical approach could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Letters from home began arriving with increasing frequency as news of Sullivan's victory reached the United States. His parents in Nebraska received congratulations from neighbors who had never paid much attention to their quiet son. Local newspapers ran articles about the farm boy who had become a war hero, though Sullivan's family was not surprised by his success. They had always known that still waters run deep. Sullivan's relationship with his squadron mates evolved from polite distance to genuine camaraderie. Pilots who had once seen him as aloof now understood that his reserve reflected focus and determination, rather than unfriendliness. They began seeking his advice on tactical matters and, including him in discussions about squadron strategy and mission planning. The transformation was perhaps most evident during evening gatherings in the squadron lounge. Where Sullivan had once sat alone with his technical manuals, he now found himself surrounded by pilots eager to learn from his experience. He shared knowledge generously while maintaining his characteristic humility, teaching younger aviators the importance of patience, preparation, and careful observation. Captain Torres noted in his intelligence reports that Sullivan's influence was improving the overall performance of Squadron 15. Other pilots were adopting his study habits and analytical approach, resulting in better tactical awareness and more successful missions. The quiet pilot's greatest achievement might not have been destroying 6 enemy aircraft, but rather inspiring his comrades to reach their own potential. As weeks passed, Sullivan began receiving requests from other squadrons for tactical consultations and training assistance. His reputation had grown beyond his immediate unit, and senior commanders recognized the value of his insights. The pilot who had once been overlooked was now considered one of the most valuable tactical minds in the Pacific Theater. 6 months after the legendary engagement, Sullivan stood before a gathering of newly arrived pilots at the Pacific Training Facility. His promotion to captain had come with new responsibilities, including the development of advanced combat tactics for fighter pilots. The man who had once disappeared in crowds now commanded the attention of auditoriums filled with eager aviators, seeking to learn from his experience. Sullivan's teaching style reflected his personality: methodical, thorough, and focused on practical application rather than dramatic storytelling. He emphasized the importance of understanding enemy capabilities, studying aircraft performance characteristics, and developing the patience to wait for tactical advantages. His students learned that aerial combat was as much about preparation and analysis as it was about flying skill and courage. The tactical manual Sullivan developed became required, reading throughout the Pacific Fleet. His systematic approach to aerial combat, based on careful observation and calculated risk-taking, influenced pilot training programs for years to come. Military historians would later credit his methods with saving hundreds of Allied lives and contributing significantly to air superiority in the Pacific Theater. Letters continued arriving from pilots across the Pacific who had successfully applied Sullivan's techniques in combat. Each message described engagements where careful preparation and tactical patience had made the difference between victory and defeat. Sullivan read every letter and responded personally, offering additional advice and encouragement to pilots facing the challenges of aerial warfare. Major Reynolds, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, often reflected on Sullivan's transformation from anonymous squadron member to legendary tactical instructor. The change had not been in Sullivan's personality, which remained as quiet and modest as ever, but in how others perceived and valued his contributions. The lesson was clear: True leadership often comes from unexpected sources. Sullivan's parents visited the base during a war bond tour, finally meeting the pilots and mechanics who had worked alongside their son. They were not surprised to learn about his methodical approach to combat, or his dedication to helping others improve their skills. These qualities had been evident during his childhood on the Nebraska farm, where he had approached every task with the same careful attention to detail. The 6 enemy aircraft Sullivan had destroyed in 20 minutes became symbols of what could be achieved through preparation and determination. Military artists created paintings depicting the engagement, and the story was retold in training films shown to new pilots. However, Sullivan always insisted that the real lesson was not about individual heroics but about the importance of never underestimating quiet, dedicated professionals. As the war in the Pacific progressed toward its conclusion, Sullivan's influence could be seen in the improved performance of fighter squadrons throughout the theater. Pilots who had learned his methods were achieving remarkable success rates, and enemy forces found themselves facing increasingly skilled and well-prepared opponents. The quiet pilot's greatest victory might have been the knowledge he shared rather than the aircraft he destroyed. Sullivan's post-war career continued his pattern of steady, reliable service combined with innovative thinking. He helped develop jet aircraft tactics during the transition to new technology, always emphasizing the fundamental principles that had made him successful: thorough preparation, careful analysis, and the patience to wait for the right moment to act. Years later, when military historians interviewed Sullivan about his famous engagement, he insisted on sharing credit with his ground crew, intelligence officers, and fellow pilots. His success, he maintained, had been built on the foundation of knowledge and support provided by dozens of other professionals. The victory belonged to everyone who had contributed to his preparation and training. The airbase where Sullivan had achieved his legendary victory was eventually named in his honor, though he protested that such recognition was unnecessary. Visitors to the Sullivan Field Museum can see his original aircraft, preserved exactly as it appeared after the engagement that made him famous. The display includes his flight logs, tactical notes, and personal letters, providing insight into the mind of the quiet pilot who changed aerial warfare. Sullivan's story became a favorite of military instructors, teaching leadership and tactical planning. The lesson was always the same: never underestimate the power of quiet competence, thorough preparation, and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances demand it. Heroes, they learned, don't always announce themselves with loud voices and dramatic gestures. In retirement, Sullivan returned to Nebraska, where he lived quietly on a small farm much like the one where he had grown up. Neighbors knew about his war record, but he rarely discussed it unless asked directly. When young people sought his advice about military service or aviation careers, he emphasized the same principles that had guided his own success: study hard, prepare thoroughly, and remember that actions speak louder than words. The quiet pilot's greatest achievement was not the 6 enemy aircraft he destroyed in 20 minutes, but the generations of aviators he inspired to approach their profession with dedication, humility, and respect for the complexity of aerial combat. His legacy lived on in every pilot who understood that true heroism often comes from the most unexpected sources.